Please, just buy me and take me away from here," the chained woman whispered desperately to the tall Apache warrior, her green eyes reflecting a terror that made even the hardened men in the dusty auction yard look away. "I'll work for you, cook for you, anything. Just don't let them sell me to him." The Apache's dark eyes flicked toward the leering man in the expensive suit who kept raising his hand, bidding higher and higher with a cruel smile that promised nothing but suffering. Then those same eyes returned to the woman's face, taking in the fresh bruises on her pale skin, the way her hands trembled despite her defiant chin. "Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing, but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. Now, let me tell you how we got to this moment, because this story didn't start with chains and auction blocks. It started 3 weeks earlier with a telegram that would change everything, in a small frontier town called Redemption Ridge, where the desert wind carried secrets and the setting sun painted everything the color of blood. Margaret O'Sullivan had stepped off the dusty stagecoach on a scorching Tuesday morning, clutching a worn leather satchel and a letter that had promised her a teaching position at the local schoolhouse. She was 24, educated in Boston, with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight and green eyes that spoke of intelligence and determination. What the letter hadn't mentioned was that the previous teacher had fled town after discovering the school was nothing more than a front for something much darker. The so-called school committee turned out to be 3 men with dead eyes and cruel smiles. Cornelius Blackwood, the town's self-appointed mayor and owner of half the businesses, his brother Edgar, who ran the saloon where screams sometimes echoed from the back rooms, and Sheriff Morton, whose badge was bought and paid for with Blackwood money. "Miss O'Sullivan," Cornelius had said, his voice smooth as snake oil, "there's been a slight change in your employment terms." But something else was watching from the shadows that day, something the Blackwood brothers hadn't counted on. What the Blackwood brothers didn't know was that Running Wolf had been tracking them for 3 months, waiting for the right moment to strike. Margaret's first week in Redemption Ridge had been a carefully orchestrated trap. The schoolhouse was a cramped room above the saloon where she was expected to teach the children of the town's most influential families, children who never seemed to show up. Instead, she found herself scrubbing floors, serving drinks, and dodging the wandering hands of drunken men who treated her like property they could sample before purchase. "You're not what we ordered," Edgar Blackwood had sneered on her 3rd night, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "But you'll have to do until we can arrange something more permanent." That's when Margaret realized the horrible truth. The teaching position had been a lie. She was meant to be sold, just like the other women who had answered similar advertisements and disappeared without a trace. The evidence was hidden in plain sight: falsified employment contracts with inconsistent signatures, a civil registry that showed hours of operation that never matched reality, and a trail of receipts with sequential numbers that didn't add up. She tried to run on a moonless Thursday night, but they caught her before she reached the edge of town. Sheriff Morton's men dragged her back through the dusty streets while decent folks closed their shutters and pretended not to hear her screams. "You've caused us considerable trouble, Miss O'Sullivan," Cornelius said as they chained her in the cellar beneath the saloon. "But trouble can be profitable if you know how to market it properly." The next morning, she heard them discussing the auction. She would be sold to the highest bidder in 3 days, along with 2 other women they'd been keeping in similar conditions. The buyers were coming from as far away as California and Mexico, men who paid premium prices for educated Eastern ladies to work in their establishments. But Running Wolf had been watching, learning, planning. He was Apache, 28 years old, with dark hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes that missed nothing. His people had been massacred by cavalry soldiers 5 years earlier, soldiers paid and supplied by Cornelius Blackwood's government contracts. He'd spent those 5 years tracking the men responsible, and his patience was about to be rewarded. The auction was set for noon on Sunday, in the corral behind the livery stable where livestock was usually sold. Running Wolf had seen enough auctions to know exactly how this one would unfold, but he'd never seen a woman fight back quite like Margaret O'Sullivan. When they dragged her up from the cellar that Sunday morning, her dress was torn and her face was bruised, but her green eyes burned with a fury that made even Edgar Blackwood step back. She'd used the 3 days in captivity to sharpen a piece of broken pottery into a crude blade, and she'd hidden it in her bodice like a woman who understood that sometimes survival meant being willing to draw blood. "Gentlemen, we have 3 fine specimens for you today," Cornelius announced to the gathering crowd of perhaps 20 men, their faces a mixture of anticipation and cruelty that made Margaret's stomach turn. "We'll start with the youngest, then work our way up to today's crown jewel, an educated lady from Boston with all her teeth and no permanent damage." Running Wolf positioned himself at the back of the crowd, his face impassive as he studied the competition. There was a cattle rancher from New Mexico whose hands shook with the tremor of a man who drank too much, a well-dressed businessman from San Francisco whose soft hands suggested he'd never done an honest day's work, and most dangerous of all, a man in an expensive suit whose pale eyes reminded Margaret of a snake studying a mouse. This last man, who introduced himself as Mr. Whitmore from Sacramento, had arrived in a fancy carriage with armed guards, and the bulge in his coat suggested he was carrying enough money to outbid anyone in the territory. The rumors about his establishments in California had reached even this remote corner of Arizona. Women who entered his employ were never seen again. "Please, just buy me and take me away from here," Margaret whispered desperately when Running Wolf moved closer to the auction block. The words tumbled out before she could stop them, her desperate plea cutting through his carefully maintained composure. But what she didn't know was that Running Wolf had already made his decision 3 days earlier, when he'd watched them drag her back from her failed escape attempt. He'd seen the way she'd fought, not just with her fists, but with her mind, studying the patrol patterns of the guards, testing the strength of her bonds, refusing to give up even when defeat seemed certain. The bidding started at $50 and quickly escalated. The rancher dropped out at $75, but the businessman and Whitmore kept pushing higher. 100, 125, 150. "Going once at $150, Cornelius called out, his voice thick with satisfaction. That's when Running Wolf stepped forward and spoke for the first time. 200. The silence that followed Running Wolf's bid was so complete you could hear the wind whistling through the desert sage beyond the town limits. Every eye in the corral turned toward the tall Apache warrior who had just offered more money than most of these men saw in 6 months. His dark hair was braided with silver and turquoise, and he wore traditional clothing mixed with pieces of white man's gear, a combination that spoke of someone who moved between two worlds but belonged fully to neither. "Now hold on just a minute," Sheriff Morton sputtered, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "We don't sell to Indians here." "Your money is good enough when you buy my horses," Running Wolf replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced down cavalry charges and lived to tell about it. "Your law says nothing about who can bid at a legal auction." Cornelius Blackwood's calculating mind was already working the angles. $200 was more than he'd expected to get for all 3 women combined, and money was money regardless of the color of the hand that offered it. But accepting a bid from an Apache would set a dangerous precedent that could complicate future business arrangements. "The bid is 200, he announced after a moment's hesitation. "Do I hear 210? Whitmore's pale eyes narrowed as he studied Running Wolf with the intensity of a man trying to calculate the odds in a high-stakes poker game. He could afford to bid higher, but something about the Apache's calm confidence suggested this was not a man who made empty gestures. 210, Whitmore called out, his voice betraying just a hint of irritation. 300, Running Wolf responded immediately, and now Margaret could see the shock ripple through the crowd. $300 was more than most cowboys earned in a year, more than enough to buy a decent horse and saddle with money left over for supplies. The businessman from San Francisco threw up his hands in disgust and walked away, muttering about crazy Indians with too much money. But Whitmore wasn't finished yet. 325, he said, his voice carrying a note of finality that suggested he was prepared to go much higher if necessary. That's when Running Wolf did something unexpected. He smiled, and Margaret felt her heart skip a beat at the transformation it brought to his stern features. Running Wolf's smile held secrets that would haunt Whitmore's nightmares for weeks to come, because the Apache had recognized him from a wanted poster in the sheriff's office. 400, Running Wolf said quietly, reaching into a leather pouch at his belt and producing a handful of gold coins that caught the sunlight like captured fire. Cash. Right now. The crowd pressed closer, straining to get a better look at wealth that most of them had only dreamed about. Margaret watched in fascination as Running Wolf counted out the money with practiced ease, each coin making a solid clink as it hit the wooden crate Cornelius had hastily positioned to serve as a counting table. Whitmore's face had gone pale beneath his expensive hat, and sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead despite the cool morning air. $400 was more than he could afford to lose without arousing unwanted attention from his business partners in California, men who expected certain profit margins and wouldn't tolerate expensive indulgences. 400 going once, Cornelius called out, his voice betraying his own amazement at the turn of events. 400 going twice. Wait, Whitmore shouted, his composure finally cracking. This is irregular. You can't just... Are you prepared to bid $410, sir? Cornelius interrupted, his tone making it clear that complaints about irregularity would not be entertained when this much money was on the table. Whitmore looked around the corral desperately, searching for support among the other bidders, but found only faces filled with curiosity and greed. These were not men who cared about the color of money or the race of the man offering it. They cared about the entertainment value of watching two determined men bid each other into bankruptcy over a woman. 420, Whitmore stammered, his voice lacking the confidence it had carried just moments before. Running Wolf studied the pale man for a long moment, taking in the nervous twitch of his left eye, the way his hands shook as he reached for his wallet, the thin sheen of sweat that now covered his entire face. Then he nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. 500, he said simply. This time the gasp from the crowd was audible, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck all the air out of the corral. $500 was enough to buy a small ranch, enough to start a new life in a place where past mistakes couldn't follow. It was more money than Margaret had ever seen in one place, more than her father had earned in 3 years of teaching at the Boston Academy for Young Ladies. Whitmore stood frozen for nearly a full minute, his mouth opening and closing like a fish struggling to breathe. Finally, he shook his head and backed away from the auction block, his defeat written clearly across his features. "Sold!" Cornelius shouted, his voice ringing with triumph. "To our Apache friend for $500. But as Running Wolf approached the auction block to claim his purchase, Margaret noticed something that sent a chill down her spine despite the warm morning sun. Sheriff Morton's hand was resting on his gun, and 3 of his deputies had quietly positioned themselves between Running Wolf and the town's main street. Margaret felt the makeshift blade pressing against her ribs through the torn fabric of her dress. A small comfort in a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. She had spent 3 days in captivity studying the faces of her captors, learning to read the subtle signs that meant violence was about to erupt like a summer thunderstorm over the desert. "Now, before we finalize this transaction," Sheriff Morton said, stepping forward with the lazy confidence of a man who believed his badge made him untouchable, "I think we need to discuss some logistics. $500 is a lot of money for an Indian to be carrying around. Makes a man wonder where it came from." Running Wolf's expression didn't change, but Margaret noticed his weight shift almost imperceptibly, the kind of movement that suggested coiled muscles ready to spring into action. His dark eyes swept the corral, taking in the positions of the deputies, the distance to the nearest cover, the location of every armed man in the crowd. "My money is legal," he said simply. "Earned from selling horses to the cavalry at Fort Bowie. Captain Morrison has the receipts if you need documentation." Cornelius stepped between the sheriff and his newest customer, his hands raised in a gesture of peace that fooled absolutely no one. "Now, Morton, let's not complicate a perfectly legitimate business transaction. The man paid fair and square, same as anyone else." But Margaret could see the conflict playing out behind Cornelius's calculating eyes. $500 was a fortune, but it was also evidence of a transaction that might draw unwanted attention from territorial authorities, if word spread to the wrong ears. The Blackwood brothers had built their empire on the principle that their illegal activities should never rise to the level where outside investigators might take interest. "Tell you what," Morton said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman, "why don't we escort our Apache friend and his new property to the edge of town, just to make sure they get off to a safe start?" The crowd began to murmur nervously, sensing the shift in atmosphere from entertainment to potential violence. Several men started backing toward the corral fence, positioning themselves to flee if shooting started. The 2 other women scheduled for auction were hastily dragged back toward the cellar, their captors unwilling to risk losing valuable merchandise in a gunfight. Running Wolf counted out the $500 onto the wooden crate, each coin ringing like a small bell in the suddenly quiet corral. Then he looked directly at Margaret, and she saw something in his dark eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. Not the possessive hunger she had expected, but something closer to understanding. "Come," he said simply, holding out his hand to help her down from the auction block. That's when Margaret realized the chains around her ankles were about to become the least of her problems. The moment Margaret's feet touched the ground, she felt the cold metal of gun barrels being pressed against Running Wolf's back by 2 deputies who had moved in from his blind spots. "You know what I think?" Sheriff Morton said, his voice dripping with false concern. "I think maybe this Indian didn't come by all that money as honestly as he claims. Maybe we should hold on to it for safekeeping while we send a wire to Fort Bowie and verify his story." Margaret watched Running Wolf's face as the trap revealed itself, expecting to see fear or anger. But instead, she saw something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if this was exactly what he had been hoping would happen. "The money stays with the woman," Running Wolf said calmly. "That was the agreement." "What money?" Morton asked with a cruel smile. "I don't see any money. Do you boys see any money?" The deputies shook their heads in unison, playing their parts in a choreographed theft that had probably been performed dozens of times before. Margaret felt rage building in her chest like steam in a boiler, threatening to explode despite the danger of their situation. But then Running Wolf did something that changed everything. He threw back his head and released a sound unlike anything Margaret had ever heard. A war cry that seemed to echo off the desert mountains and hang in the air like the promise of approaching thunder. The response was immediate and terrifying. From the rooftops of the buildings surrounding the corral came answering calls, the voices of Apache warriors who had been positioned and waiting for exactly this moment. Margaret counted at least 6 different voices, possibly more, all of them carrying weapons that glinted in the morning sunlight. "You see," Running Wolf said conversationally, as if armed men weren't suddenly visible on every building around them, "I didn't come to your auction alone. My brothers have been watching your town for 3 days, learning your patterns, counting your weapons, studying your weaknesses." Sheriff Morton's face had gone white as fresh snow, and his hand was trembling as he tried to decide whether to draw his gun or run for cover. The deputies looked like men who had just realized they were standing in the middle of a powder keg with lit matches in their hands. "But we're not here for a fight," Running Wolf continued, his voice remaining perfectly calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "We're here for justice. You see Cornelius Blackwood, 5 years ago your supply wagons carried weapons to cavalry units that murdered my family. Women and children shot down like animals while they slept." Cornelius stepped backward, his face reflecting the dawning understanding that this was not a random encounter but a carefully planned confrontation that had been years in the making. "And you, Sheriff Morton, signed the reports that covered up the massacre. Reports that described my people as hostile combatants when they were nothing more than refugees seeking shelter from a winter storm." Margaret felt the pieces clicking into place like tumblers in a lock, realizing that her rescue was not the primary objective, but a fortunate side effect of a much larger plan. What Margaret didn't understand yet was that Running Wolf had been planning this confrontation for months. But meeting her had changed everything about how he intended to finish it. The standoff stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Armed Apache warriors on the rooftops keeping their weapons trained on the men in the corral, while Sheriff Morton and his deputies tried to figure out how to escape a situation that had spiral. The silence was broken by the sound of a woman's voice calling out from one of the upper windows of the saloon, a voice Margaret recognized as belonging to one of the other captives. "There are more women in the cellar," the voice shouted. "6 of them chained up like animals." Running Wolf's jaw tightened, and Margaret saw something dangerous flicker behind his dark eyes. This was clearly information he had not possessed before, intelligence that changed the scope of what was happening here. "Cornelius," Running Wolf said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that often preceded terrible violence, "how many women have you sold in the past year?" "Now see here," Cornelius blustered, sweat now pouring down his face despite the cool morning air. "I run a legitimate business establishment. If you have accusations to make, you can take them up with the territorial authorities." "The territorial authorities are 3 days' ride from here," Running Wolf replied. "But my justice is right here, right now." Margaret felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge, with the potential for violence that could leave dozens of people dead scattered across the dusty corral. She thought about the improvised blade hidden in her bodice, about the other women trapped in the cellar, about the justice that Running Wolf had been seeking for 5 years. Then she made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "Wait," she said, stepping forward despite the guns and the tension and the very real possibility that she was about to get shot. "There's a better way to do this." Every eye in the corral turned toward her, from the Apache warriors on the rooftops to the terrified deputies still holding their weapons with shaking hands. Margaret felt the weight of all that attention, but she also felt something else, the clarity that came from finally understanding what needed to be done. "You want justice," she said to Running Wolf, "and these women need to be freed. But if you kill these men here and now, more men just like them will come to take their place. The system that created this situation will continue." Running Wolf studied her face intently, as if trying to read her intentions in the depths of her green eyes. "What are you proposing?" he asked. Margaret smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I'm proposing we burn it all down, but we do it smart." The plan Margaret outlined in those desperate moments would either save them all or get them killed, but it was built on evidence that no territorial authority could ignore. "The contracts," she said quickly, her mind racing as the pieces fell into place. "The falsified employment contracts, the doctored civil registry records, the receipt sequences that don't match. I've been documenting everything for 3 days. And more importantly, I know where they keep the real records." She had noticed it during her captivity, the way Edgar Blackwood disappeared into a back room of the saloon every evening with a ledger book and a bottle of whiskey. The way he emerged hours later with ink-stained fingers and the satisfied expression of a man who had balanced numbers that needed to stay balanced. "The real accounting books are hidden behind a false wall in Edgar's office," Margaret continued. "Names, dates, payments received, transportation arrangements, everything. 5 years' worth of evidence that could bring down not just the Blackwood brothers, but their entire network." Running Wolf's expression shifted as he grasped the implications of what she was suggesting. Justice through the legal system rather than through violence, retribution that would reach far beyond these 3 men to encompass everyone who had profited from their activities. "And if we're caught trying to retrieve these records?" he asked. "Then we're no worse off than we are right now," Margaret replied. "But if we succeed, we can bring this entire operation down and make sure it never happens again." She could see the internal struggle playing out behind Running Wolf's dark eyes, the conflict between the immediate satisfaction of violent revenge and the longer-term goal of systemic justice. 5 years of planning had brought him to this moment, and she was asking him to risk everything on the word of a woman he had known for less than an hour. "The Apache way is not always the best way," he said finally, and Margaret heard something in his voice that suggested this was a lesson learned through bitter experience. "Sometimes the white man's law can be a weapon if you know how to use it." Sheriff Morton chose that moment to make a fatal mistake. "This is all very touching," he sneered, "but you're still thieves and murderers, and I'm still the law in this town." The gunshot that followed came not from any of the Apache warriors, but from Running Wolf himself, drawing and firing his revolver in one smooth motion that sent Morton's hat spinning into the dust. The bullet had passed so close to the sheriff's head that Margaret could see the man's hair stirring in its wake. "The next one won't miss," Running Wolf said calmly, already holstering his weapon. "Now, I think it's time we had a look at those accounting books." Margaret felt something wild and dangerous stirring in her chest as she realized that for the first time in weeks, she was no longer a victim. She was a partner in justice. Breaking into Edgar Blackwood's office required skills that Margaret had never imagined she would need, but desperation makes quick students of us all. The plan was elegantly simple in its audacity. While Running Wolf and 3 of his warriors kept the Blackwood brothers and their men pinned down in the corral, Margaret would slip into the saloon through the back entrance and retrieve the evidence they needed. The other Apache warriors would maintain their positions on the rooftops, ensuring that no one could escape to summon help from neighboring towns. "The false wall is behind the painting of the naked woman," Margaret whispered to Running Wolf as they finalized the details. "There's a hidden latch on the left side of the frame." She had discovered this during her second night of captivity, when Edgar's drunken bragging had included a detailed description of his secret treasure room, where he kept items too valuable or incriminating to store in the bank. At the time, she had filed the information away as potentially useful for escape. Now it might be the key to justice. The rear entrance to the saloon was guarded by a single man, one of Edgar's hired guns, who clearly hadn't expected to deal with anything more dangerous than a drunk cowboy. Margaret approached him with her hands visible and empty, playing the role of a frightened woman seeking refuge from the chaos in the corral. "Please, sir," she said, affecting a trembling voice that wasn't entirely an act. "Could I hide inside until this is over? Those Indians look like they mean to scalp everyone." The guard relaxed slightly at the sight of what appeared to be a helpless female, his attention focused on the sounds of shouting coming from the front of the building. That moment of inattention cost him dearly. Margaret's improvised blade slid between his ribs with surgical precision, finding the spot her father had shown her years ago during his anatomy lessons at the medical college. He dropped without a sound, and Margaret stepped over his body with the cold efficiency of someone who had moved far beyond squeamish concerns about violence. Edgar's office was exactly as she remembered it, a cramped room that reeked of whiskey and unwashed bodies, dominated by a massive oak desk covered with papers that probably contained enough evidence to hang half the territorial government. The painting of the naked woman hung on the far wall, its garish colors and anatomically impossible proportions suggesting it had been painted by someone with more enthusiasm than talent. The hidden latch was exactly where Edgar had described it, disguised as a decorative element in the frame's ornate carving. Margaret pressed it and heard the satisfying click of a mechanism engaging, followed by the soft whisper of the false wall swinging inward on well-oiled hinges. What she found behind that wall exceeded her wildest expectations for the scope of the Blackwood brothers' criminal enterprise. The hidden room contained enough evidence to bring down half the territorial government and expose a corruption network that stretched from Arizona to California. Ledger books lined the shelves like leather-bound soldiers, each one meticulously documenting transactions that would have made Margaret sick to her stomach if she'd had time to read them in detail. Instead, she focused on gathering the most damning evidence: the master ledger that contained names, dates, and payments, a collection of forged government documents, and a correspondence file that included letters from officials as high as the territorial governor's office. But the most shocking discovery was a detailed map marked with locations throughout the Southwest, each one annotated with numbers that Margaret realized represented the number of women who had been processed through that particular facility. Redemption Ridge was just one stop on a network that extended far beyond anything she had imagined. The sound of gunfire from the front of the building reminded her that time was running short. Margaret stuffed the most crucial documents into her bodice alongside the blade she had used on the guard, then grabbed the master ledger and the map. Whatever else happened, this evidence had to survive. She was halfway back to the rear entrance when she heard footsteps on the stairs leading to the office. Edgar Blackwood's voice, thick with drink and fury, was shouting orders to someone about securing the books and cleaning up loose ends. Margaret pressed herself against the wall beside the staircase, clutching the stolen documents against her chest. "You check the office," Edgar was saying to someone Margaret couldn't see. "I'll handle the Apache problem permanently." The man who emerged at the top of the stairs was one she recognized from the auction, a thin, nervous individual with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. He carried a rifle that looked too large for his bony frame, and his hands shook with either fear or excitement. Margaret waited until he had passed her hiding spot and entered the office, then struck with the swift efficiency of someone who had already crossed the line from victim to predator. Her blade found the base of his skull with anatomical precision, severing the connection between brain and body in a single motion that left him twitching on the floor like a broken marionette. Edgar's shout of discovery echoed from the office as he found the empty space behind the false wall. "The books! The goddamn books are gone!" Margaret was already moving, racing down the stairs toward the back entrance with Edgar's footsteps thundering behind her. She burst through the rear door of the saloon just as the first of Running Wolf's warriors appeared around the corner of the building, his painted face grim with the promise of violence. "I have it," she called out, waving the ledger above her head. "I have everything." That's when Edgar Blackwood's rifle cracked from the upstairs window, and the world exploded into chaos. The bullet meant for Margaret's back instead shattered the wooden post beside her head, sending splinters flying like angry wasps as Running Wolf's warrior dove to tackle her to the ground. From her position in the dust behind the water trough, Margaret could see the battle unfolding with the surreal clarity that sometimes accompanies moments of extreme danger. Apache warriors moved like shadows across the rooftops, their war cries echoing off the desert mountains as they systematically eliminated Edgar's remaining men. The corral had become a battlefield where 5 years of careful planning finally erupted into violent reality. Running Wolf appeared beside her with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his life moving through hostile territory. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his dark eyes scanning her for signs of injury while his hands checked the documents she had clutched against her chest. "I'm fine," Margaret replied, surprised to discover that it was true. The terror and helplessness that had defined her existence for the past weeks had been replaced by something harder and more focused, a determination to see this through to whatever end awaited them. Edgar's rifle cracked again from the upstairs window, but this time the return fire came from 3 different directions simultaneously. The window frame exploded in a shower of glass and splinters, and Edgar's screaming suggested that at least one of the bullets had found its mark. "The other women," Margaret said urgently, "in the cellar. We have to get them out before—" Her words were cut off by the sound of splintering wood and the distinctive whoosh of flames catching hold. Looking toward the front of the saloon, Margaret could see orange light flickering behind the windows and black smoke beginning to pour from under the doors. "Cornelius," Running Wolf said grimly. "He'd rather burn the evidence than let it fall into the wrong hands." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. The other captive women were trapped in the cellar directly beneath the burning building, probably chained to the walls just as she had been. The accounting books and correspondence files that remained in Edgar's office would be ash within minutes, destroying evidence that could have brought justice to dozens of victims. But the documents in her hands might still be enough to expose the network, if they could survive long enough to get them to territorial authorities. "There's another way into the cellar," she said, remembering details from her imprisonment that had seemed unimportant at the time. "Through the root cellar behind the general store. The tunnels connect." Running Wolf's expression shifted as he processed this information, weighing the risks of a rescue attempt against the certainty that the women would die if they did nothing. That's when they heard the screaming from beneath the burning building, and the decision was made for them. The tunnel beneath the general store was barely wide enough for a grown man, and Margaret could hear the women's screams growing more desperate with each passing moment. Running Wolf moved through the narrow passage like a man born to confined spaces, his knife cutting through the thick wooden beams that blocked their path, while Margaret followed close behind with the precious documents tucked securely in her bodice. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning wood, and she could feel the heat building as the fire spread through the connected cellars. "Here!" Running Wolf called out, his voice muffled by the stone walls. "I can see light." The opening led into the main cellar where Margaret had been held, but the scene that greeted them was far worse than anything she had imagined. 7 women were chained to the walls in various states of injury and malnutrition, their faces reflecting the hopeless terror of people who had given up believing in rescue. "Who's got the keys?" Margaret demanded of the nearest woman, a dark-haired girl who couldn't have been more than 17. "Edgar," the girl whispered. "Always Edgar. He keeps them on a ring in his pocket. Margaret looked at Running Wolf, and they both understood the implications. Edgar was either dead or dying in the burning building above them, along with the keys that could free these women. The heat was growing stronger by the minute, and smoke was beginning to filter down through the floorboards overhead. Running Wolf examined the chains that held the women, running his fingers along the metal links with the expertise of someone who understood the engineering of captivity. "These are old," he said after a moment. "The metal is weakened by rust and poor maintenance." He drew his knife and began using the pommel as a hammer, striking the weakest links with concentrated force while Margaret worked to calm the terrified women. The sound of metal striking metal rang through the cellar like a death knell, each blow a race against the advancing fire. The first chain snapped just as the floorboards above them began to sag with the heat. Margaret helped the freed woman to her feet, noting the rope burns around her wrists and the haunted look in her eyes that spoke of horrors beyond physical injury. "Can you walk?" Margaret asked. The woman nodded, and Margaret guided her toward the tunnel entrance while Running Wolf continued his assault on the remaining chains. The heat was becoming unbearable, and Margaret could see flames beginning to lick through the cracks in the ceiling. They were going to run out of time. But then she remembered something Edgar had mentioned during one of his drunken boasts, something about a spare set of keys hidden in the cellar for emergencies. She found them in a wooden box behind the water barrel, and the sound of locks clicking open was the sweetest music Margaret had ever heard. The last woman was freed just as the ceiling began to collapse, and their escape through the burning tunnels became a desperate race against death itself. Margaret found herself at the rear of the group, making sure none of the rescued women fell behind as they crawled through the smoke-filled passage toward safety. The documents pressed against her ribs with each movement, a constant reminder of the evidence that could bring justice to countless victims if they could just survive the next few minutes. Running Wolf had taken the lead, his warrior's instincts guiding them through the maze of connected cellars and storage tunnels that honeycombed the ground beneath Redemption Ridge. Behind them, the fire roared like a living thing, consuming the physical evidence of the Blackwood brothers' crimes but unable to touch the proof that Margaret carried against her heart. They emerged from the root cellar behind the general store just as the saloon's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. The sound was like thunder rolling across the desert, and Margaret could feel the heat on her face even from 50 yards away. The Apache warriors had completed their work with brutal efficiency. Sheriff Morton lay dead in the corral where he had fallen, his deputy's badge now a mockery of the justice he had perverted. Cornelius Blackwood was nowhere to be seen, but the tracks leading toward the desert suggested he had chosen flight over a fight he couldn't win. Edgar's body hung from the second-story window of the burning saloon. Whether from the smoke or the bullets was impossible to determine and irrelevant to the women he had brutalized. "It's over," Running Wolf said simply, helping the last of the rescued women to her feet in the dusty street that had witnessed so much suffering. But Margaret knew it wasn't over, not really. What they had accomplished here was just the beginning, a single victory in a war that would require the combined strength of law and justice to truly win. She pulled the documents from her bodice and spread them on the ground for Running Wolf to see. The master ledger, the correspondence files, the network map, everything they needed to expose a criminal enterprise that stretched across the Southwest. "Captain Morrison at Fort Bowie," she said. "He's an honest man, a cord," eyeing to the letters. "If we can get this evidence to him." Running Wolf nodded slowly, understanding the full scope of what she was proposing. Justice through law instead of revenge through violence. "Justice for everyone," Margaret corrected. "Your family, these women, all the victims we'll never know about." As the sun set over the burning town of Redemption Ridge, painting the desert sky the color of blood and gold, Margaret realized that her rescue had become something far more important than either of them had originally intended. It had become the beginning of a partnership that would change everything. 3 months later, Margaret O'Sullivan stood in the courtroom in Tucson as the territorial judge read the verdict that would dismantle the largest human trafficking network in the Southwest's history. The evidence she and Running Wolf had retrieved from Edgar Blackwood's hidden room had proven even more damning than they had hoped. 14 government officials were facing federal charges, including the territorial governor's chief of staff. 23 men had been arrested in simultaneous raids across Arizona, New Mexico, and California. The network that had destroyed so many lives was finally being brought to justice through the very legal system it had corrupted. Running Wolf sat in the gallery behind her, no longer the desperate warrior seeking violent revenge, but a man who had found a different kind of satisfaction in systematic justice. The transformation in both of them had been remarkable to witness. She was no longer the terrified captive begging for rescue, and he was no longer the isolated avenger driven by rage and loss. The 7 women they had rescued from the burning cellar were scattered across the territory now. Most of them returned to families who had given them up for dead. 2 had chosen to remain in Arizona, finding work and new lives in communities that promised them safety and respect. 1, the 17-year-old with the dark hair, had asked Margaret to teach her to read so she could help other women who might need saving. "The court finds the defendants guilty on all charges," Judge Harrison intoned, his voice carrying the weight of justice too long delayed. "They will be sentenced to terms of hard labor as prescribed by territorial law, and their assets will be forfeited to provide compensation for their victims." Margaret felt Running Wolf's hand rest gently on her shoulder, a gesture of support that had become as natural as breathing over the past 3 months. They had spent those months traveling together, gathering testimony from victims, tracking down additional evidence, and slowly building the case that had brought them to this moment. Somewhere along the way, the practical partnership born of necessity had evolved into something deeper, a love built on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than the desperate circumstances of their first meeting. They had proven that 2 people from different worlds could find common ground in the pursuit of justice. The small ranch they had purchased outside Tucson was modest but comfortable, a place where they could build a life together while continuing their work to help other victims of trafficking networks. Margaret had established a school for rescued women, teaching them skills that would allow them to rebuild their lives with dignity and independence. Running Wolf had used his connections with various Apache tribes to create an informal intelligence network that tracked suspicious activities across the territory. His people had suffered too much at the hands of corrupt officials to let such crimes go unnoticed and unpunished. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of their victory was the knowledge that Cornelius Blackwood, who had indeed escaped into the desert that terrible day, was now a hunted man with a federal bounty on his head. The network he had spent years building was in ruins, and his former associates were eager to provide information about his whereabouts in exchange for reduced sentences. As they walked out of the courthouse into the warm Arizona sunlight, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since that desperate morning when she had begged an Apache warrior to buy her freedom. She had gained not just her own liberation, but a purpose that gave meaning to the suffering she had endured. "What now?" Running Wolf asked, his dark eyes reflecting the same contentment she felt. Margaret smiled and took his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the strength that had carried them both through the darkest of times. "Now we go home," she said simply, "and we keep fighting the good fight." Their story had begun with chains and ended with freedom, not just for themselves, but for countless others who would benefit from the precedent they had set. Love, it turned out, was not just about finding someone to share your life with. Sometimes it was about finding someone to share your mission with, someone who understood that justice was worth any sacrifice. The desert wind carried the sound of their laughter as they walked toward their wagon, two people who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and emerged stronger than either could have been alone. As Margaret had learned during those terrible days in captivity, survival sometimes required being willing to draw blood. But as she and Running Wolf had proven together, the most lasting victories came not from violence, but from the patient, determined pursuit of justice through law and evidence and truth. Their love story was written not in poetry, but in court documents and freed captives, and a criminal network brought to justice. It was a love that had changed the world, one rescued woman at a time. Thank you for following Margaret and Running Wolf's incredible journey. If this story moved you as much as it moved me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share in the comments what part of their story resonated most with you, and let me know what other Wild West tales you'd like to hear. Your support means everything to this channel, and together we keep these powerful stories of courage and justice alive.